The United States Navy could not stand this man. He drank too much. He cursed at admirals, in writing when possible. And while Washington demanded high-grade steel, he kept building his boats out of plywood. Here's what I find remarkable. Without this man, there is no Normandy, no Iwo Jima, no major Allied landing anywhere. Not because the troops weren't brave enough, but because they physically could not have reached the sand. So today I want to ask a question that sounds absurd until you see the numbers. How did the entire Allied invasion strategy in Europe and the Pacific come to depend on one loud, bourbon-loving boat builder from the Louisiana swamps? His name was Andrew Higgins, and the boat that broke Hitler's Atlantic Wall. He originally designed it for swamp trappers who didn't want to explain themselves to the police. Let's take this machine apart, piece by piece. But to understand why this boat had to exist, we first need to understand the problem. And the problem was a wall. Look at a map of Europe in 1942, the way planners in London and Washington had to look at it. The entire continent belongs to one man, and that man is pouring concrete. From the fjords of Norway to the Spanish border, bunkers, gun casemates, minefields, beach obstacles, the Atlantic Wall, thousands of fortified positions along more than 1,500 miles of coastline, built by hundreds of thousands of laborers, consuming millions of tons of concrete and steel. The most expensive defensive line human beings had ever constructed. Now, here's the thing about Hitler's strategy that I think gets lost in the newsreel footage. The wall was never meant to be strong everywhere. It didn't have to be. German planners knew something every military academy on Earth taught as gospel. An invasion from the sea lives or dies on supply. You can put men on a beach, but men need ammunition, fuel, vehicles, food, thousands of tons of it every single day. And in 1942, there was exactly one kind of place where you could unload that much cargo. A port. Cranes, piers, deep water. So the Germans did the logical thing. They turned every major port on the Atlantic coast into a fortress. Defend the ports, and the invasion strangles itself. The rest of the coastline? Let them land on an empty beach. They'll starve there. And before you dismiss that as German arrogance, the Allies agreed with them. Ever since Gallipoli in the First World War, where a whole Allied army bled for months on Turkish beaches and then simply left, the professional consensus was brutal. A landing from open water against the defended shore is close to suicide. Then, in August of 1942, the theory was tested. 6,000 men, most of them Canadians, attacked the French port of Dieppe head-on. In one single morning, more than half of them were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors were back in England by dinner time. The lesson was written in blood, and both sides read it. The Germans read it as, "The wall works. Keep pouring concrete around the ports." The Allies read it differently. If storming a port is suicide, then we have to land where there is no port, on the open beach, which meant every man, every tank, every crate of ammunition would have to come ashore, on a boat that could run itself onto the sand. One small problem. The United States Navy didn't have that boat. What it had was the Bureau of Ships, the official body responsible for designing every vessel in the fleet. Hundreds of naval architects, some of the finest engineering credentials in the country. And when these men sat down to design a landing craft, they did what their training told them to do. They designed a ship, a proper ship, Welded steel, because steel is what warships are made of. A deep hull, because deep hulls handle open water. A sharp bow, because sharp bows cut through waves. Every choice was correct, by the standards of ship design. And now, let's watch what happens when this correct, professional steel boat approaches an actual beach. 100 yards from shore, maybe more, that deep hull kisses a sandbar and stops. Dead. The boat draws too much water to go further. The ramp? There is no ramp. Soldiers climb over the sides, over gunwales chest high, and drop into water they cannot see the bottom of. A man is carrying 60, 70 pounds of gear, rifle, ammunition, radio batteries. He lands in water up to his chest, sometimes over his head. And somewhere ahead, behind that concrete, a machine gun has been waiting for exactly this moment. An entire boatload of men, standing still, waist deep, 100 yards from cover. That is not a landing craft. That is a delivery service for targets. Here's the part that, frankly, still gets me. This wasn't a secret. Fleet exercises through the late 30s showed it again and again. Boats grounding on bars, rifles soaked, men exhausted before they ever touched dry sand. The Marines, the people who would actually have to ride these things into gunfire, were filing reports, practically begging for something better. And the Navy's design offices kept refining their own boat, politely, procedurally, year after year. The Bureau had 100 trained naval architects. The problem was, all 100 of them kept designing ships that behaved like ships. Nobody was designing a boat that behaved like a truck. So this is the dead end, and I want you to hold it in your mind. The entire Allied strategy now depends on crossing 30 yards of surf, and the official machinery of the world's greatest industrial power cannot produce a boat that gets a rifleman onto sand with dry boots. The answer to that problem did already exist, by the way. It wasn't in a Navy yard. It wasn't in Washington. It was idling in 18 inches of brown water, somewhere deep in a Louisiana swamp. And the local police would have dearly loved a word with some of its owners. So who designs a boat that behaves like a truck? Not a naval architect. Someone who spent his whole life around trucks, lumber, and mud, and who never had much respect for people with diplomas. Andrew Jackson Higgins. And no, despite everything this story is about to become, he wasn't even from Louisiana. He was born in 1886 in Columbus, Nebraska, about as far from the ocean as America gets. If you went looking for his name in school records, you'd find it in the disciplinary files. He was thrown out of Creighton Prep in Omaha for fighting. He never did collect a formal education. What he collected instead was lumber. The timber business pulled him south, first Alabama, then New Orleans, where in 1922 he set up the Higgins Lumber and Export Company, importing hardwood from the Philippines, from Central America, from Africa. And here I have to be honest with you about our hero's business record, because it is not a straight line going up. The lumber company went broke. By 1930, at the bottom of the Great Depression, all Higgins had left was the side business, a small boatyard he'd originally built just to move his own timber, fewer than 75 employees. A bankrupt lumberman in a bankrupt economy with a workshop. If you were writing a textbook on how to build an industrial empire, this biography would be printed in the chapter called Don't. But that little boatyard had one priceless asset: its customers. Because think about who actually needs a boat in southern Louisiana. Fur trappers working flooded marshland. Oil crews hauling drilling gear into the bayous. Loggers dragging cypress out of the swamps. And, the story goes, a certain category of businessman who moved cargo through the back channels at night and preferred not to discuss the paperwork. Prohibition was still the law of the land, after all. Now, look at what this clientele demands from a boat. And I mean demands. These are not people who write polite complaint letters. The water is 18 inches deep in places. The bottom is mud, sand, logs, cypress stumps. There are no piers, there are no docks. You run the boat straight up onto the bank, throw your cargo out, and back off under your own power. And if the boat breaks, you are 40 miles into a swamp, and nobody is coming. The Navy's architects designed for the open ocean. Higgins designed for that. His answer was called the Eureka, and I want to walk you through it because every single feature is the swamp talking. First, the bow. Not sharp, a rounded, reinforced scoop. Higgins called it a spoonbill. The boat doesn't cut toward the shore, it rides up onto it, beaches itself high and dry, unloads, and then slides back off, undamaged, on purpose, as a feature. Naval architects spent their careers making sure ships never touch the bottom. Higgins built a boat whose entire job description was touching the bottom. Second, the propeller. In 18 inches of water, an exposed prop lasts about a minute before a log or a sandbar chews it apart. So Higgins recessed it into a semi-tunnel, a protected channel in the hull. The water flows through, the debris doesn't. Third, the hull itself planed high at speed and shrugged off impacts that would hole a conventional boat. Full throttle over floating logs, through vegetation, that was normal operation. You see what happened here, right? 20 years before the U.S. Navy knew it needed a boat that could charge onto a hostile beach, unload, and pull itself back off, Louisiana's trappers, oilmen, and midnight entrepreneurs had already paid Higgins to perfect one. The swamp had been running beach landing trials for a decade. It just never filed the paperwork. And Higgins knew what he had. That's the thing about him. The man was loud, profane, and allergic to modesty, but he was not wrong. Through the late 30s, he pushed the Eureka at anyone in a uniform who would listen. The Marine Corps listened. The Marines had been staring at the landing problem for years, and when they saw a boat that ran itself onto a beach and backed off, laughing, they wanted it. Badly. But the Marines didn't buy boats. The Navy bought boats, and the Navy had a bureau for that. The men of that bureau looked at this bellowing lumberman from New Orleans, with his plywood swamp skiff and his 0 engineering degrees, and went back to refining their own steel design. For years, that's where the story stuck. The best landing boat in America ferried muskrat pelts, while the official landing craft kept drowning riflemen in fleet exercises. What finally broke the deadlock wasn't an admiral changing his mind. It was a photograph, taken in 1937 on the far side of the world by a young Marine lieutenant watching somebody else's war through binoculars. A photograph the Navy had already dismissed. When it finally landed on Higgins's desk 4 years later, it completed the weapon. 1937, Shanghai. A 24-year-old Marine lieutenant named Victor Krulak is watching the Japanese invade China, officially as an observer, unofficially with binoculars and a camera, taking notes on somebody else's amphibious war. And what he sees changes everything. Japanese landing barges are running up to the shore, and their bows are falling open. A hinged ramp drops onto the sand, and men, carts, light vehicles roll straight out, dry, fast, in seconds. Nobody climbs over the side. Nobody drowns under 60 pounds of gear. The bow is a door. Krulak photographs everything, writes it up, and sends the report to Washington. And Washington files it. The story goes that his report came back with a note dismissing it as the ravings of, quote, some nut out in China. Whether those exact words were ever written down, I can't prove it, but the outcome is documented well enough. For 4 years, the United States Navy sat on photographic evidence of a solved problem and did nothing with it. So in 1941, Krulak, by now back in the States, does something wonderfully unprocedural. He walks past the whole apparatus and brings the idea to the one man in America who's been screaming about landing boats for a decade. He shows Higgins the picture. And Higgins doesn't request a study, doesn't ask who'll pay. He puts his own designers on it at his own expense and grafts a drop ramp onto the Eureka's bow. Swamp boat plus Japanese door. That combination, that exact combination, is the boat from every D-Day photograph you have ever seen. Now, you might think that at this point the Navy would simply say, "Thank you." You'd be wrong, and honestly by now, you knew you'd be wrong. Higgins had been fighting the naval establishment since the 30s. This is a man who, on a visit to Washington, was handed the blueprints of the Navy's own landing boat design, the official one, the one with all the credentials behind it, looked them over, and wrote directly on the drawings, "This boat stinks," and signed it with his initials, A.J.H. I've read a lot of procurement history, and I want you to appreciate how rare this is. Most people fight bureaucracy with memos. Higgins fought it with graffiti. But by the spring of 1942, this feud stopped being funny. America was in the war now, and the planners had a date circled. November. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The first great Allied amphibious operation, the first real test of everything. The shortage of landing craft was so desperate that President Roosevelt ordered a crash program just to make the operation physically possible. And there was still no working boat that could put a tank onto a beach. The Navy's official tank lighter had failed its trials. Higgins had built his own in 61 frantic hours back in 1941. And it worked. So, naturally, in April 1942, the Bureau of Ships signed contracts for 1,100 tank lighters of its own failed design. 1,100 boats for an invasion 6 months away, based on a design that had already flunked its own tests. Let that sit for a second. This is no longer a story about hurt feelings. Men were going to ride these things into gunfire. It took a senator from Missouri to force the issue. Harry Truman, then the chairman of a Senate committee hunting waste in war production, heard about the tank lighter mess and demanded the only test that couldn't be argued with. A head-to-head trial. Higgins's boat against the Bureau's boat. Same day, same water, same load. May 25th, 1942, off Norfolk, Virginia. Each boat takes on a 30-ton tank. The wind is up, the water is rough, genuinely rough, white caps and spray. The Bureau's steel lighter goes out first, and the sea starts beating it apart. Water over the sides, the crew struggling, the boat wallowing under its load. By several accounts, it comes close to going down entirely, tank and all. Then the Higgins boat runs the same course. Same tank, same sea. It just does it. Takes the waves, carries the load, delivers the tank. The plywood king from the swamps didn't edge out the United States Navy on points. He embarrassed it, in public, in front of the referees. And this time, there were referees. Truman's committee dug through the whole affair, and its final verdict deserves to be read aloud. Because Senate reports do not usually sound like this. Quote, "The Bureau of Ships has, for reasons known only to itself, stubbornly persisted for over 5 years in clinging to an unseaworthy tank lighter design of its own." For reasons known only to itself. In the polite dialect of official Washington, that is roughly a declaration of war. The contracts flipped. The fleet would ride Higgins' boats. So the outsider won the argument, completely, officially, in writing, which left only one small detail. Somebody now had to actually build the invasion fleet. Tens of thousands of boats on deadlines nobody in peacetime shipbuilding would believe. And here's where I have to tell you about the strangest business deal in this whole story. Because Higgins had seen this moment coming 3 years earlier, and he'd prepared for it by quietly walking into the mahogany market and cornering it. 1939. The war in Europe is weeks old. America is neutral, and most American businessmen intend to stay that way. And in New Orleans, a boat builder who can barely make payroll starts placing orders for Philippine mahogany. Big orders. Then bigger ones. By the time he's done, Higgins has bought up the entire 1939 Philippine mahogany crop, an entire year's harvest of one of the world's finest boat-building woods, and stockpiled it in Louisiana. Think about what this bet actually says. It says there will be a war. America will be in it. The war will demand small boats by the thousand, and when that day comes, steel will be rationed, prioritized, fought over, but nobody in Washington will think to lock up wood. Every part of that forecast came true. When the government later moved to control strategic materials, Higgins was already sitting on his mountain of mahogany like a dragon with a purchase history. The man had outplanned the War Production Board before it existed. And I want to pause on this because it's the part of the Higgins story that I think gets misread. It's tempting to file him under colorful eccentric, the cursing, the bourbon, the graffiti on blueprints. But watch the pattern. The ramp, built at his own expense before any contract existed. The tank lighter, built in 61 hours before anyone ordered one. The mahogany, bought years before the demand. This isn't eccentricity. This is a man who keeps solving the problem before he's asked to, because he's certain the ask is coming. The Navy ran on procedure. Higgins ran on forecast. Now the forecast came due, and the numbers went vertical. Before the war, one boatyard, fewer than 75 workers. By 1943, 7 plants across New Orleans and more than 20,000 workers running around the clock. Higgins put boat hulls on assembly lines. He built landing craft in a converted department store. When he ran out of roofed space, he built them in the open air in the Louisiana sun under canvas. City buses were rerouted to move his shifts. One company in one city was outproducing entire national shipbuilding programs. In the category of boats the Navy had spent 5 years insisting didn't need to exist. But here's the piece of this industrial miracle that I find genuinely moving. Go stand on that factory floor for a second. 1943, New Orleans, the segregated Deep South. Jim Crow is not a metaphor here. It's the furniture of daily life. And on the Higgins line, working side by side, white men and black men. women running machinery, workers in their 60s and 70s, workers with disabilities. All of them paid by one rule: equal pay for the job rating, no exceptions. The first fully integrated industrial workforce in New Orleans. Meanwhile, same city, same months, over at another shipyard, white workers walked off the job because one black man was promoted to a skilled position. Now, I won't stand here and paint Higgins as a civil rights saint. That's not what the record shows. What the record shows is maybe more interesting. Higgins needed boats built faster than anyone in America, and he flatly refused to let the local caste system slow him down. If you could build boats, you were hired and you were paid. He didn't ask society's permission, the same way he hadn't asked the Navy's. And his integrated workforce buried the competition. There's a lesson in there that has nothing to do with 1943, and I suspect you've already spotted it. Prejudice isn't just a moral failure. It's an efficiency failure. Higgins simply ran the experiment. So what did all of this, the mahogany, the assembly lines, the 20,000 hands, actually add up to? Here's the number. And I need to frame it carefully because, said carelessly, it sounds like fantasy. By September of 1943, of the roughly 14,000 vessels in the United States Navy, about 92%, more than 12,000 of them, were built to Higgins designs. 9 out of 10. Now, the honest footnote: these were overwhelmingly small craft. Landing boats, patrol boats, lighters, not battleships or carriers. And many were built by other yards under license to his designs. But that's exactly the point. The Navy that had spent 5 years refusing this man's blueprints was now, numerically speaking, sailing on them. All told, Higgins Industries turned out more than 20,000 boats before the war ended. The bankrupt lumberman from the chapter called Don't was now running one of the most productive war industries on Earth. There was just one thing left that the boats hadn't done. Everything so far, the trials, the contracts, the production records, all of it happened in American waters, on American terms. The real exam had a date, June 6th, 1944, and an examiner, the Atlantic Wall itself. Let's go to the water. June 6th, 1944. Somewhere off the coast of Normandy before dawn. Picture where you are. You're one of 36 men standing in a plywood box, 36 feet long. The transports dropped you into this thing 11, 12 miles out, hours ago. The channel is running 4-foot swells, and the boat takes them flat-bottomed, slamming every one. Everything is wet. The air is diesel exhaust and salt and vomit. Almost no one has kept their breakfast down, and the boat's own bilge pump is losing the argument. Over the engine you can hear the battleships behind you, firing over your head at a shore you can't see yet. And ahead of you, at the front of the boat, there is a steel ramp. For hours, that ramp is what's kept the sea out. And you know, every man aboard knows, that at some point very soon, it's going to open. That morning, boats built on Higgins's lines ran men onto 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Wave after wave after wave, hundreds of them shuttling between the fleet and the sand. On 4 of those beaches, the system worked terribly and well enough. And then there was Omaha. I'm not going to sanitize this. At Omaha, the ramp going down was the most dangerous moment in a most dangerous place on Earth. The German gunners on the bluffs had had years to study the geometry of that beach, and when a ramp dropped, it opened a doorway 3 men wide directly into interlocking machine gun fire. In the worst sectors, in the first waves, there were boats that lost most of the men aboard within moments of that door falling open. The plywood that made the boat fast and cheap and everywhere was never armor, and no one had ever pretended it was. The Higgins boat made the landing possible. It could not make the landing safe. Nothing could. Those first minutes were paid for by the men, not the machine. And I think any honest history of this boat has to stop and say that plainly. But now step back with me. From one boat at Omaha, back up to the map, back to the strategy. Because this is where the whole 4-year story pays off. Remember the German bet from the beginning of this video? An invasion needs a port. Ports can be fortified. Therefore, fortify the ports, and the coastline defends itself. For that bet to hold, one assumption has to stay true: that an army cannot be supplied across an open beach. And what's grinding back and forth between the fleet and the sand all day on June 6th, and all week, and all month? Thousands of shallow draft boats, each one running itself aground on purpose, dropping a ramp, unloading riflemen or a jeep or 3 tons of ammunition, backing off and going back for more. The Allies didn't capture a port on D-Day. They brought the port with them. And the moment that worked, look at what happens to the Atlantic Wall on the map. 1,500 miles of coastline, and now every beach on it is a potential harbor. The Germans can't be strong everywhere. No one can. The concrete is still exactly where it was poured, around the ports, and the war simply walks in around it, across the sand. 4 years of construction, unthinkable tonnages of concrete and steel, outflanked by a boat you could build in a converted department store. Reportedly, when Hitler learned how many landing craft the Allies had put in the water, he called Higgins, a man he'd never met, the new Noah. I can't verify the quote-reached paper from his lips, but as a summary of what happened to his wall, it's hard to beat. And Normandy wasn't even the boat's whole war. Flip the globe. The Pacific, where the same problem came dressed in coral. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Island after island with no ports at all, where every single campaign began with ramps dropping into surf. And in fairness, the Pacific also showed the boat's limits. At Tarawa, the tide betrayed the landing. Higgins boats grounded on the reef hundreds of yards out, and Marines waded in chest deep under fire, dying in the lagoon. The lesson was brutal, and the Corps learned it. Over coral, you needed tracked amphibians to lead, with the Higgins boats hauling the follow-up waves. No single machine wins a war. But by 1945, from 2 oceans, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever the Allies decided the war would go next, it went ashore in a boat from New Orleans. Andrew Higgins stood at the top of American industry. 20,000 workers. The gratitude of generals. Production records no one had thought possible. The war had built him an empire. And the peace he'd done as much as any industrialist to bring closer, was about to take it apart in 90 days. Victory over Japan, August 1945. In New Orleans, the celebration lasted about as long as it took Washington to pick up a telephone. The war economy didn't wind down, it stopped. Contracts worth millions were canceled in batches, sometimes with a single wire. An industrial empire built entirely on one customer was about to find out what happens when that customer goes home. And the timing could not have been crueler, because Higgins hit peace already at war, this time with the unions. The same stubbornness that had beaten the Bureau of Ships turned out to be a much worse weapon against organized labor. Disputes with the AFL and the CIO boiled over. By late October, some 2,000 workers had walked out. Higgins responded the only way Higgins knew how: head on. He shuttered plants, he dug in, and on November 9, 1945, barely 3 months after the war ended, he liquidated Higgins Industries. The company that had built 20,000 boats for the greatest war in history dissolved before the confetti was fully swept up. He tried again, of course. He was Higgins. 2 months later, he was back with a new company, Higgins Incorporated, building pleasure boats now for the boom he was sure was coming because forecasting had never failed him before. But the post-war market had no urgency in it. No Truman Committee to force a fair race, no invasion deadline making his speed priceless. Peacetime rewards patience, distribution, salesmanship. Everything Higgins wasn't. The new firm survived. It never soared. And New Orleans society, for its part, never did open the doors. The man who had employed 30,000 of the city's people, who had put the city's name on the machine that carried the Allied war effort ashore on 2 oceans, remained to the old families of the Garden District what he'd always been: a loud, profane Nebraska lumberman who drank bourbon and didn't know his place. On the 1st of August, 1952, Andrew Higgins died in the hospital, a stroke at 65 while being treated for stomach ulcers. His sons kept the company going for another 7 years. In 1959, it closed for good. No fleet bears his name today. Most Americans walking past the D-Day photographs, the ramp down, the men in the surf, have no idea who built the box they're looking at. Which brings me to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 1964. A young historian named Stephen Ambrose is sitting with Dwight Eisenhower, the former Supreme Commander, the former President, working on his biography. And somewhere in that conversation, Eisenhower asks him, "Do you know who Andrew Higgins was?" Ambrose doesn't. And Eisenhower, the man who commanded the largest amphibious invasion in human history, says this: "He's the man who won the war for us." And then he explains, if Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. The whole strategy of the war. That's not a eulogy talking. That's a commander, 20 years later, still doing the math. And here's the detail I can't let go of. Higgins had been dead for 12 years. The highest praise any American soldier ever gave him. He never heard it. It arrived, like so much in his story, after the paperwork was closed. So, what do I actually take away from this story? Let me put my cards on the table and then I'll let you go. I've made a lot of these videos, and the Higgins file keeps teaching me the same uncomfortable lesson. The breakthrough didn't come from the center. It came from the edge. And I don't think that's an accident. The Navy's architects were solving a procedural problem. Satisfy the specification, respect the tradition, protect the career. The swamp was solving a real one. 18 inches of water, a log under the hull, 40 miles from help. Reality is a better teacher than any review board, because reality doesn't grade on a curve. And when the establishment rejected Higgins, it wasn't really rejecting his boat. The boat, demonstrably, worked. It was rejecting him. The accent, the bourbon, the missing diploma, the graffiti on the blueprints. The system couldn't tell the difference between wrong and unfamiliar. And that confusion nearly cost it the war. Worth asking what your industry's version of the bureau looks like. Every era has one. Now, before you go, Higgins wasn't the only outsider who outbuilt the establishment in that war, and he wasn't even the most improbable. On the West Coast, there was a construction man, a road builder, a dam builder, who had never launched a ship in his life. By the middle of the war, his yards were turning out a full ocean-going cargo ship every 3 days. The Navy said it couldn't be done. He did it before breakfast, and then he got faster. That story, how a man who didn't know the rules of shipbuilding rewrote them, is next on Strategic Blueprint. Subscribe so you're here when the keel goes down. And if this story of one stubborn man and his plywood boat taught you something today, pass it on. Somebody in your life is fighting a bureau of their own right now. They should probably hear about Andrew Higgins.